At 8:22 p.m., a 10-year-old girl was still holding a phone receiver with both hands, listening to her mother's voice crackle through the line. By 8:40 p.m., the phone was hanging quietly in its cradle, swaying just enough to catch the parking lot lights. 40 years later, investigators would say the most important part of the case happened in less than 15 minutes. What happened in the time no one was watching? Before we delve deeper, please tell me where you heard this from. On a February night in Chilliwack, the rain was steady but unremarkable, the kind that residents of the Fraser Valley barely noticed anymore. Cars passed through the intersection at Vedder Road and Watson Road, their tires hissing against wet asphalt, headlights stretching into thin, broken reflections across the parking lot of a small convenience store that stayed open late because people always needed something at night. At 8:22 p.m., a 10-year-old girl was standing beneath the shallow metal hood of a public payphone outside that store, gripping the receiver with both hands to keep it from slipping, listening to her mother's voice on the other end of the line. She was cold, wet, and upset. But she was not afraid yet. She had done what she had been taught to do. She had found a phone. She had called an adult. Minutes later, that same receiver would be resting quietly in its cradle, the line dead, the call finished, while the rain continued falling as if nothing unusual had happened at all. When her parents arrived less than 20 minutes later, the phone was still there. The store lights were still on, cars were still passing. But the girl was gone. For more than 40 years, investigators would return to that brief window of time, trying to understand how a child could vanish from a well-lit public place without anyone seeing enough to stop it, and why the most important part of the story seemed to happen not in chaos but in near silence. What happened in the minutes after that call ended? Jo-Anne Pedersen had a habit of filling quiet spaces without drawing attention to herself. When a room fell silent, she did not rush to speak, but she often hummed, softly and almost unconsciously, as if sound itself made her feel less alone. It was something her mother noticed most clearly in the kitchen, where Joanne would lean against the counter and sing fragments of whatever melody had stuck with her that day, sometimes misremembered, sometimes blended with another song entirely, but always gentle enough that it never demanded to be heard. She was not a child who pushed herself forward. At school, teachers described her as shy, attentive, the kind of student who watched before participating and waited for the right moment to raise her hand. Her classmates remembered her more for how she listened than for how she spoke, and for the way she smiled quickly, and then looked away, as though embarrassed by her own reaction. On the evening of February 19th, 1983, Joanne wore a light jacket that was already thin from use, its sleeves a little too short at the wrists, and sneakers that soaked through easily when the ground was wet. Her bangs, cut straight across her forehead, clung to her skin as mist turned into rain, and she kept pushing them aside with the back of her hand in the same small, practiced motion. In one pocket, she carried loose change and a folded piece of paper with a phone number written carefully in pencil. She checked it often, not because she needed to, but because knowing it was there made her feel prepared. Joanne memorized things instinctively, numbers, roots, lyrics, believing, in the way children sometimes do, that remembering was a form of control. Earlier that week, she had stood beside her mother while dinner cooked, singing under her breath as Angela worked, watching closely to see if her mother would notice. Angela had pretended not to hear, then smiled, anyway, mouthing the wrong words on purpose, and Joanne had laughed, surprised by being seen. It was a small moment, unimportant at the time. Like so many others, it would take on weight only later. The walk home that evening had not felt unusual in any way that mattered. Joanne walked alongside her older sister and a teenage cousin. their steps uneven as they navigated puddles and damp sidewalks, the conversation drifting between teasing and irritation in the way it often did when children were tired and ready to be home. "Stop copying me," her sister snapped at one point, speeding up just enough to create distance. "I'm not," Joanne replied, quickening her pace to close the gap, her voice quieter but insistent. The argument was minor, forgettable, the kind that burned briefly and left no visible mark. They reached the townhouse together, laughter already returning as the front door swung open and then shut again, the lock clicking into place with a sharp, final sound. "Hey," Joanne called, knocking lightly at first, then harder. "Come on." Inside, there was a burst of muffled laughter, followed by whispered encouragement to wait just a little longer. It was a joke, a prank. The sort of thing siblings did without thinking through the consequences, confident that nothing truly bad could come of it. Across the small courtyard, a neighbor stepped onto his porch, shielding a cigarette from the rain with one hand. He noticed the child at the door, registered the scene, then looked away. Children locked themselves out sometimes. Parents were usually nearby. Inside the house, her sister hesitated, hand hovering over the lock as the laughter faded into uncertainty. By the time the door finally opened, the porch was empty. The sound of that lock would replay in her sister's mind for decades afterward. A single, ordinary noise transformed into something unbearable, marking the moment when a harmless decision crossed an invisible line. Joanne waited longer than she needed to, standing close to the door as rain seeped into her sleeves and trickled down the back of her neck. She knocked again, then again, her knuckles stinging slightly with each attempt, until the realization settled in that no one was coming right away. The courtyard felt different once that understanding took hold. Wider, quieter. The familiar shapes of neighboring homes blurred behind a veil of rain, and the street beyond seemed farther away than it had moments earlier. She hugged her arms around herself and took a breath, steadying the small knot of frustration forming in her chest. Crying would not help. Waiting might, but waiting also meant getting colder. Joanne thought about her parents, about where they might be, and about the piece of paper in her pocket. She had a solution, a reasonable one, the kind adults encouraged. She turned away from the door and started walking toward the corner, her steps measured and deliberate, choosing the lit sidewalk, instead of cutting across darker patches of lawn. Each movement felt purposeful, as though the act of deciding had already carried her partway toward safety. It was a simple choice, and it made sense. She did not know that it would be the most important one she ever made. While Joanne made her way down the street, the rest of the world continued along its usual paths, unaware that anything had shifted. At the Legion Hall, Angela Riley sat at a small table near the wall, her coat draped over the back of her chair, a half-finished drink in front of her. The room carried the familiar mix of voices and laughter, punctuated by the scrape of chairs and the dull clink of glass on wood. Nothing urgent pulled at her attention. Nothing suggested she should be anywhere else. Saturday nights often unfolded this way, unremarkable, predictable, safe. Back in the neighborhood, porch lights flicked on as the sky darkened, and televisions glowed behind curtains. A radio played somewhere, the sound, distorted by distance and rain, turning music into something almost abstract. Joanne reached the corner store just as another customer stepped out, holding the door open briefly before it closed again with a muted thud. Warm air escaped into the cold, carrying the smell of coffee and sugar and something fried. Inside, the penny pincher was busy, as it often was on weekend evenings. People moved between aisles with baskets and armfuls, coats dripping onto the mat near the entrance. A bell chimed each time the door opened, the sound sharp and bright against the low murmur of conversation. Joanne hovered near the counter, shifting her weight from foot to foot, then spoke up when there was a pause. "Can I use the phone?" she asked. The clerk glanced at the line forming behind her, then nodded toward the door. "There's one outside, sweetheart." Joanne hesitated, looking back at the store's bright interior, then at the rain-streaked glass separating her from it. "Okay," she murmured, and turned back toward the night. The payphone stood beneath a shallow metal hood bolted to the wall, its surface cold and slick beneath Joanne's fingers. Raindrops struck the hood with a steady rhythm, loud enough to notice but not loud enough to drown out the sound of passing traffic. She dug coins from her pocket, her hands stiff from the cold, and fed them into the slot one at a time, listening for the familiar clink that told her the machine was ready. The receiver felt heavier than she expected when she lifted it, solid and reassuring, a tangible link to someone who could fix what had gone wrong. Joanne dialed the operator first, reciting the name of the Legion Hall without checking the paper in her pocket. She knew the number already. She always did. As she waited for the connection, she shifted closer to the wall, shrinking her body beneath the hood, trying to make herself smaller against the weather. Headlights swept across the lot as cars turned through the intersection, their drivers unaware of the small figure standing just beyond the store's glow. When the line finally connected, Joanne leaned forward, pressing the receiver tighter against her ear, the cold plastic biting into her skin. She was doing everything right. "Legion Hall?" a voice answered. "Can I talk to my mom, please?" Joanne asked, her voice thin but steady. There was a pause, then movement. Then Angela's voice came through, warm and familiar despite the static. "Hi, sweetheart." "I'm locked out," Joanne explained, the words tumbling out more quickly now that she had reached her. "They went inside and—" "It's okay," Angela replied, already rising from her chair. "We'll come get you." Relief loosened something in Joanne's chest, and she nodded even though her mother could not see it. She stayed on the line, listening to the background noise of the hall, the distant laughter and music bleeding through the phone. Then another sound entered the space between them. A man's voice. Close, confident, too near to be accidental. "Excuse me," he said. Joanne felt the receiver shift in her hand. Angela straightened, her smile fading as she heard the change. "Hello? You'd better get here within half an hour," the man continued. "If not, I'm calling the police." There was no anger in his tone, no urgency that suggested panic, just a statement, delivered as though he believed it was the responsible thing to do. Angela leaned closer to the phone. "Please wait," she urged. "We're on our way." The pause that followed stretched longer than it should have. Then the line went dead. Joanne stared at the receiver, her reflection faintly visible in the scratched plastic, her breath fogging the surface. She did not know what to do next. Jo-Anne stayed where she was, clutching the receiver for a moment longer before carefully returning it to its place. She glanced toward the store, then back, at the parking lot, as though expecting someone to reappear and explain what had just happened. No one did. The rain soaked deeper into her jacket, darkening the fabric, weighing it down. She shifted from one foot to the other, rubbing her hands together to bring back some warmth. Minutes passed. Cars continued to come and go, their drivers focused on their own errands, their own destinations. The payphone remained where it was, silent and unmoving, offering no hint that it had just been the center of something important. Joanne waited. At the Legion Hall, Angela and her husband did not finish their drinks. They left coins on the table and pulled on their coats, the shift from casual conversation to focused urgency happening so quickly it felt unreal. The drive back to the penny pincher took between 15 and 20 minutes, depending on traffic and lights. That night, every red signal felt deliberate, every passing second a test of patience. Angela watched the clock on the dashboard, her mind cycling through reassurance and worry in equal measure. Joanne would be fine. Someone had been with her. A man had intervened. That meant help, did it not? Rain streaked across the windshield, blurring the road ahead. When they turned into the parking lot, headlights swept across empty pavement. Angela's stomach dropped. The payphone stood alone beneath its hood, illuminated by the store's lights, its receiver hanging neatly in place as though it had not been touched in hours. Joanne was not there. Neither was the man from the call. Angela stepped out of the car, rain soaking through her shoes as she crossed the lot, scanning shadows, checking behind parked vehicles, her gaze darting from one possible explanation to the next. "Joanne?" she called, her voice sounding strange in the open air. No answer. She touched the metal hood of the phone, flinching at the cold, then turned in a slow circle, searching for movement, for anyone who might explain what she was seeing. Nothing. Cars passed on the road beyond the lot, their drivers unaware that something had gone wrong in plain sight. Angela felt a hollow open beneath her ribs, a quiet absence where certainty had been moments earlier. "This doesn't make sense," she murmured. The rain did not care. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Angela stood with her hands pressed together, as if holding on to something invisible, her thoughts racing ahead while her body lagged behind. Her husband paced once, stopped, then started again, his movements sharper now, his eyes sweeping the lot with growing intensity. "She has to be close," he insisted, though his voice betrayed doubt. "She wouldn't just leave." Angela pushed through the store's door, the bell clanging sharply as conversations faltered and heads turned. She explained quickly, breathless, words tumbling over each other. "My daughter was just here," she said. "She was using the phone." The clerk frowned. "She went outside." Angela nodded. She already knew that. Back outside, her husband tried to stop a passing car, asking the driver if they had seen a little girl. The man shook his head, confused, and drove on. Angela reached into her pocket, expecting her phone, and found only keys. Her hands trembled as she tried again, then lowered them slowly. "Call the police," she said at last. The words felt heavy, unreal. As her husband ran back toward the car, Angela remained by the payphone, unwilling to leave the spot where she had last been connected to her daughter. Somewhere between the ringing phone and the distant sound of sirens, the night changed its shape. What had begun as an inconvenience became something else entirely, and no one yet understood how permanent that change would be. By the morning after Jo-Anne Pedersen disappeared, the Penny Pincher parking lot no longer looked like the scene of a crime. The rain had washed away whatever faint traces might have existed. Traffic resumed its ordinary rhythm, and the corner returned to its familiar role as a place people passed through rather than stopped to remember. What remained was not evidence, but interpretation. Fragments of recollection that investigators would spend years trying to align into something coherent. In those early days, the investigation moved with the confidence that often accompanies urgency. Officers knocked on doors along Vetter Road, waking residents who had slept through the night, unaware that a child had vanished within sight of their windows, and asked the same careful questions, listening less to what people said than to how certain they sounded when they said it. Most remembered the rain, some remembered headlights, a few remembered nothing at all, which was, in its own way, the most unsettling response. Inside the store, accounts converged only at the beginning. Yes, the girl had been there. Yes, she was wet and upset. Yes, she asked to use the phone. Everything after. That dissolved into impression rather than fact, shaped by angle, distraction, and the natural human tendency to fill gaps with assumption. Someone thought they saw her leave. Someone else thought she stayed longer. No one could say why they believed what they believed. What investigators did have, almost immediately, was a voice. The man who had taken the receiver from Jo-Anne during her call to her mother existed first as tone, rather than appearance, described not by his face but by the way he spoke, firm, controlled, unmistakably adult. That detail mattered because it separated him from the chaos the public imagined. He had not shouted, he had not threatened violence, he had not demanded anything. Instead, he had invoked authority, promising to call police if the situation was not resolved, as though his primary concern was order rather than harm. In the logic of early investigation, that made him central. It wasn't unreasonable. He was the last known adult to interact with Jo. Anne, he had placed himself physically between a child and her parent. He had left before her family arrived. These facts were clean, easily arranged, and reassuring in their clarity. They allowed the case to be shaped around a single figure, a focal point onto which uncertainty could be projected. Witness descriptions followed, imperfect but consistent enough to reinforce the theory. A tall man, dark jacket, a car nearby that might have belonged to him, a presence that could be tracked, named, interrogated. And in those first weeks, the investigation leaned into that shape, not out of laziness, but because it felt like progress. The family, too, clung to the idea, the notion that someone identifiable had taken Jo-Anne, that her disappearance could be traced to a decision made by a single person rather than the randomness of the world, offered a strange comfort. It suggested intention. Intention suggested motive. Motive suggested resolution. But even then, small details resisted the narrative. The threat to call police, for instance, sat uneasily with what investigators knew about predatory behavior. People who intended to harm children did not typically invite law enforcement into the situation. They avoided attention. They disappeared quickly. This man, by contrast, had done the opposite, at least verbally. Those contradictions were noted, then quietly deprioritized, crowded out by the urgency to act before time erased what little remained. As days passed without results, the family's routines changed in ways that were both subtle and profound. Angela kept the phone line open, avoiding long calls in case it rang. She began to recognize the sound of the house settling at night, the way pipes knocked and floors creaked, noises she had never noticed before because they had never mattered. Joanne's room remained untouched, not out of superstition, but because altering it felt like conceding something she was not ready to surrender. Search efforts expanded. Outward, then circled back, as volunteers combed riverbanks and fields with a diligence that bordered on ritual. Each area was covered carefully, methodically, and then released back into the landscape when nothing was found. The absence of discovery did not bring relief. It deepened the unease. Weeks later, when the phone rang at Mary Riley's house, the sound cut through routine with unnatural sharpness. The voice on the line did not identify itself. It did not explain. It commanded attention, and then delivered something far worse than words. The sound of a child crying, uncontrolled and desperate, stripped of context and meaning. The call lasted seconds. Its impact lasted decades. The implications were immediate and severe. Jo-Anne, or someone meant to sound like her, had been alive long enough for someone to weaponize her distress. More disturbing still was the realization that Mary's number was unlisted, inaccessible to anyone without either prior knowledge or direct coercion. For investigators, the case changed shape overnight. What had been framed as a disappearance hardened into something unmistakably violent, and the earlier focus on the man at the phone booth intensified, reinforced by the belief that cruelty of that nature implied proximity and control. But cruelty alone does not identify a perpetrator. As the months unfolded, alibis were checked and rechecked, timelines scrutinized with increasing precision. The man associated with the vehicle near the store cooperated fully, his account supported by details that refused to fracture under pressure. Nothing tangible tied him to Jo-Anne beyond geography and coincidence. The realization that he might not be responsible did not arrive as a revelation, but as an erosion. Each piece of evidence that failed to confirm suspicion weakened the structure built around him, until the theory no longer collapsed, but simply failed to hold. This was not closure, it was displacement, with the obvious suspect receding. Investigators were forced to widen their scope, turning toward individuals whose connection to the case was not defined by that night alone, but by patterns that extended beyond it. Names surfaced quietly, drawn from unrelated files, whispered into relevance by similarity rather than proof. Dennis Dodington was one of them. He was not linked to Jo-Anne by a single moment, but by an accumulation of unease, another child, another disappearance, another set of circumstances that echoed too closely to ignore. He denied involvement, and there was no evidence strong enough to contradict him. But his presence in the investigative periphery altered the tone of the case, shifting it from a search for a single answer to an examination of something more diffuse and unsettling. At the same time, investigators began to look more closely at Jo-Anne herself, not to assign blame, but to understand the world she moved through. Friends mentioned small habits her family had not known, the way she lingered after school, the routes she preferred, the comfort she found in watching cars pass and imagining where they might be going. None of it suggested danger. All of it suggested familiarity. Somewhere in that familiarity, investigators believed, was the key, and somewhere else, someone was listening. The file had been opened so many times that the paper no longer resisted touch, its edges softened by years of handling, corners bent just enough to signal familiarity rather than carelessness. There was nothing dramatic about the moment it was reopened this time. No urgency, no sense that anything new would emerge. Only the quiet persistence of someone who had learned, the hard way, that answers rarely announce themselves, and that truth often waits patiently inside things already seen. The photograph lay where it always had, halfway through the file, its image unremarkable at first glance. The penny pincher storefront, rain streaking the windows, light bleeding outward, into the parking lot, a familiar image, one that had been studied before without yielding anything that changed the shape of the case. But familiarity can dull attention, and distance can sharpen it again. The investigator leaned closer, not looking for something new, but looking to see whether something old now refused to stay quiet. The timestamp sat where it always had. The angle was the same, but the reflection was wrong. It took a moment to understand why. The human eye expects symmetry, expects reflections to behave, to obey the logic of light and surface. This one did not. Near the edge of the frame, partially swallowed by glare, was a shadow that did not belong to the store, did not align with the angle of the lights, did not behave like rain or passing traffic. It was too defined, too intentional. The investigator's attention narrowed, excluding everything else. The photograph, the timestamp, the witness statement attached behind it, the one that mentioned a vehicle briefly, present, dismissed, because it did not fit the prevailing theory at the time, the receipt from a nearby business, its time printed faintly but clearly enough to place that vehicle closer than anyone had realized. The pause between the end of the phone call and the empty lot stretched in his mind, no longer abstract, no longer theoretical, measurable. The thought arrived fully formed, uninvited and impossible to ignore. This was not after. This was happening while everyone was still looking the wrong way. The instinct was to reject it, to assume error, coincidence, misinterpretation. The investigator straightened, forcing distance, then leaned back in again, retracing the logic step by step, He checked the timestamp against the original negatives, then against the store's clock records, then against weather data that explained the pattern of reflections without explaining the shadow itself. He called another detective into the room, then another, watching their faces as they followed. The same trail, waiting for someone to say what he was still hoping to hear. That it was nothing. No one did. Phones came out, names were verified, old interviews were pulled, not skimmed, but read slowly, with attention paid to what had once been glossed over. The same name surfaced again, not as a suspect this time, but as a presence that had never truly left the edges of the case. When the realization finally settled, it did not come with relief. It arrived physically, like weight shifting without warning. The investigator sat down, palms flat against the table, grounding himself against the clarity now pressing in from all sides. There was no satisfaction in being right, no vindication in uncovering what had been missed. Only the hollow understanding that the truth had been there all along, obscured not by complexity, but by expectation. Now they had to confront it, and the person it pointed to. They reached him on an afternoon that felt stalled in place, the sky heavy and colorless, the air carrying the kind of stillness that made every sound seem louder than it should be. The house sat on a quiet street, well-kept, unremarkable, its normalcy offering no hint of what waited inside. The investigator paused before knocking, listening to the muffled sounds beyond the door, the television, the faint clatter of something being set down, the rhythms of an ordinary life continuing uninterrupted. This was not about force. It was about inevitability. The man who opened the door looked older than the photographs suggested, his face registering recognition for just a fraction of a second before settling into something neutral, practiced. He invited them in without protest, stepping aside as if this visit had always been a matter of time rather than surprise. The door closed softly behind them, sealing the room into quiet. "Do you remember the night Jo-Anne Pedersen disappeared?" the investigator asked. The man exhaled, a sound edged with impatience rather than fear. "I've answered that before. We're asking again." "I wasn't involved," he insisted quickly, as if speed itself might strengthen the denial. "I told you that. I told everyone." "You were in the area," the investigator said, not accusing, simply stating. "A lot of people were. You were closer than you said." The man shifted, crossing his arms, then uncrossing them, his body betraying the composure his voice tried to maintain. "You don't have proof." "We have timing," the investigator replied, "and a car you didn't mention." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, the kind that invites either truth or retreat. The man's gaze dropped to the floor, his jaw tightening as though holding something back. "That doesn't mean anything," he muttered. "I was just passing through." "You stopped?" "No." "You waited." The man let out a brittle laugh, humorless and sharp. "You can't prove that." "We don't need to," the investigator said. "We need you to explain why the timeline only makes sense if you were there when the call ended." The man said nothing. Minutes passed, long enough for the silence to become unbearable. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he whispered finally, the words fracturing as they left his mouth. "What did you mean to happen?" the investigator asked. The man rubbed his face with both hands, dragging them down slowly, as if trying to erase something that would not disappear. "I thought someone else would come," he said. "I thought she'd be fine." "But you stayed." "I stayed. And then—" His voice dropped to almost nothing. "And then she didn't scream." The arrest that followed was quiet, procedural, devoid of drama. There was no resistance, no outburst, only the subdued movements of someone who understood that denial no longer served him. Evidence was secured methodically, items catalogued that had once blended seamlessly into an unremarkable life. Neighbors watched without comprehension as he was escorted out, unaware of what had just shifted on their street. The investigator remained in the room for a moment afterward, staring at the space where the man had been sitting, aware that truth, once spoken, does not feel complete. It only feels final. Angela was at home when the call came. She recognized the voice immediately, even before he introduced himself, and something in her posture changed, as though her body had learned to understand news before her mind allowed it. She did not sit down right away. She listened standing, one hand braced against the counter, the room around her fading into distance. The words were careful, measured, chosen to do as little harm as possible. They told her they had answers. They told her they had identified the person responsible. They told her Jo-Anne had not left that parking lot alone. Angela lowered herself into a chair slowly, as if gravity had increased without warning. For a long moment she said nothing at all, her mind racing ahead of the words, assembling fragments into something she was not yet ready to hold. After a silence that stretched beyond comfort, she asked one question. Was she scared? No one answered immediately. Questions followed later, one at a time, each carrying its own weight. How long? Where? Why her? Some answers existed, others did not, and never would. The relief she had imagined for years did not arrive cleanly. Instead, it tangled with horror, with grief renewed and sharpened by specificity. Knowing did not lessen the loss. It changed its shape. Her hands shook after the call ended. She remained seated long afterward, staring at nothing, absorbing the truth, not as information, but as something physical that settled into her body. Later still, she learned the detail that stayed with her the longest. The man had helped search for Jo-Anne in the days after she disappeared, had walked the same ground, had spoken her name aloud alongside others. All those years, he had not left town. He had been there, close enough to be mistaken for help. With the truth exposed, the story of that night could finally be told without distortion. After the phone call ended, the man at the booth left, believing he had done what was required of him. In the moments that followed, another figure, one who had watched rather than intervened, approached Jo-Anne, spoke calmly, moved quickly. There was no struggle that anyone noticed, no sound that carried far enough to matter. By the time her parents arrived, the opportunity had already passed. What followed was not disappearance, but concealment, sustained by patience and the quiet confidence that time erases more effectively than lies. The clues had always been there. A car dismissed because it didn't fit expectation. A pause described as confusion rather than action. A man who appeared helpful, and therefore was not questioned deeply enough. No single failure explained the delay, only the accumulation of assumptions. Charges were filed soon after, supported by corroborated timelines, recovered evidence, and his own words. He was taken into custody without incident, held pending trial as the legal process moved forward. For the system, there was resolution. For Jo-Anne's family, there was only the truth, arriving decades late, heavy enough to carry for the rest of their lives. Under the weight of evidence that had finally converged after decades of uncertainty, the legal process moved more quickly than anyone expected. There was no prolonged spectacle, no drawn-out contest over facts that had already been corroborated from too many angles to dispute. The man who had been arrested did not insist on a full trial. Months passed rather than years, and in the end he entered a guilty plea to charges that reflected what investigators now understood Jo-Anne Pedersen's disappearance to be, an abduction that ended her life. The sentence was severe and unambiguous. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for decades, spoken aloud in a courtroom that felt smaller than it should have, its air heavy with a finality that could not undo what had been lost. When the judge read the sentence, the man did not look back at the gallery. He kept his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, his shoulders rigid, his face revealing nothing that could be mistaken for remorse or defiance. It was not a dramatic moment. It was quieter than that, stripped of performance, leaving the words themselves to do the work they could do. Jo-Anne's family were present, sitting together rather than apart, a deliberate choice after years in which grief had pulled them in different emotional directions. Angela listened to the sentence without visible reaction, her hands folded in her lap, her posture steady, as if movement might fracture something she had only just managed to hold together. When it was her turn to speak, she did not raise her voice. She did not catalogue her pain. She spoke instead about a child who loved to sing quietly, who memorized phone numbers, who believed adults would help when asked. The point of her statement was not anger, but recognition, an insistence that Joanne be seen as more than a case file or a cautionary tale. When it was over, Angela did not look at the man who had been sentenced. She had already spent too many years orienting her life around his shadow. In the years since, the perpetrator has remained where the court ordered him to be, moving through the routines of incarceration without public comment. Appeals were filed and denied. Statements were minimal. There has been no attempt to recast himself as misunderstood, no visible effort to claim redemption. His story ends there, deliberately, because extending it further would grant it a significance it does not deserve. What matters is not how he lives now, but that he no longer has the freedom to harm, to hide, or to be mistaken for something benign. For Joanne's family, life did not return to what it had been before, because nothing could. Instead, it rearranged itself around a truth that, painful as it was, had finally replaced the corrosive uncertainty of not knowing. Angela sought counseling after the case concluded, not because grief had arrived late, but because it had changed form. The questions that once looped endlessly, where, who, why, gave way to quieter, heavier ones about how to live with a loss that now had edges and detail. Relationships within the family shifted again, some growing closer through shared understanding, others bearing scars from years of guilt and silence. Jo-Anne's sister, now an adult with children of her own, locks doors instinctively, then pauses, reminding herself why. Once a year, on Jo-Anne's birthday, they gather not at a grave, but at the riverbank they searched so many times, bringing flowers and standing together without needing to speak. The community of Chilliwack carries the case differently now as well. For decades, Jo-Anne's disappearance had existed as a warning without resolution, a story parents told in fragments, a symbol of vulnerability tied to a single corner where a payphone once stood. In the years following the case's resolution, schools revised policies around supervision and communication, not as reactions born of panic, but as acknowledgments of what can happen in moments that seem ordinary. Local advocacy groups began using Jo-Anne's story, with her family's consent, to talk about child safety in terms that emphasized awareness rather than fear. A small memorial plaque was installed near the former site of the penny pincher store, not naming the crime, but naming Jo-Anne, her age, her love of music, the fact that she mattered. What this case revealed, more than anything, was how easily certainty can mislead. Investigators followed a logical path for decades, one that made sense given what they believed they were seeing. It was only when they questioned that logic itself that the truth emerged. In the years since, law enforcement agencies have placed greater emphasis on revisiting early assumptions in cold cases, understanding that time does not only erode memory, it can also clarify patterns that were once invisible. Families facing similar limbo now have access to specialized units and advocacy organizations that did not exist when Joanne disappeared, structures built in recognition that unresolved loss requires sustained attention, not quiet resignation. Prevention, in the wake of this story, has come to mean something more nuanced than fear. It means teaching children not only to seek help, but to stay visible when they do. It means encouraging adults to act, but also to remain present rather than assuming responsibility ends with a phone call. Organizations dedicated to missing and exploited children emphasize these subtleties now, focusing on community, awareness that empowers rather than alarms. The lesson is not that danger lurks everywhere, but that protection is most effective when it is shared and sustained. Above all, Jo-Anne Pedersen is remembered not for the way her life ended, but for who she was before it did. A 10-year-old girl who filled quiet spaces with song, who believed in preparation and kindness, who trusted that adults would do what was right. Her family has said, repeatedly, that this is how they want her known, not as a symbol, but as a person whose future was taken before it could unfold. The dreams she might have pursued will never be realized, but her name now carries a legacy of awareness and change that reaches beyond the boundaries of her short life. There are questions that will never be answered fully. What, precisely, passed through the mind of the man who watched rather than walked away? Why a moment of choice tipped toward harm rather than restraint? Human psychology does not yield all its secrets, and pretending otherwise offers only false comfort. What can be known is that capacity for harm often hides behind familiarity, and that recognizing it requires attention rather than suspicion. Truth, when it finally arrived in this case, brought no clean relief. It brought closure laced with new pain, justice shadowed by grief. And yet, those who lived with uncertainty for so long have said they would choose knowing over not knowing every time. Memory can only be tended properly when it is grounded in reality. If there is a call to take from Jo-Anne Pedersen's story, it is not one of fear, but of care. Pay attention. Stay present. Speak up when something does not align. Communities protect themselves not through paranoia, but through shared responsibility. Joanne was 10 years old. She deserved a future that extended far beyond a rainy night and a phone call that ended too soon. May she be remembered for her voice, her quiet songs, and the life she lived not only for the crime that took her, and may bearing witness to her story make us just a little more attentive to one another.